Seven Hungarian origin myths. Myths of the Hungarian settlement of the Carpathian Basin. People love stories. They entertain, they help explain the unknown and build a sense of community. But just one more step takes you from story to myth. And myths sometimes have a darker side, as they are used to obscure the truth or manipulate people. The results can be catastrophic. So by all means, enjoy your myths, but also be aware where the objective truth lies. In this video, I want to examine some of the myths I've heard, both online and in person, about the arrival and settlement of the Hungarians in the Carpathian Basin. Honfoglalás. I've done the boring research, so you don't have to. The first one is the most recent and the easiest to dismiss. Myth number 1. 30,000 years in Hungary. That is, Hungarians have lived in the Carpathian Basin for 30,000 years. Or, a subvariant, the Hungarians lived in the Carpathian Basin 30,000 years ago, left and returned. This myth is one with a very nasty taste. Basically, we were there first, and now it's ours forever. Everyone else must leave. I wonder where we've heard that recently. But my first point of clarifications is what the keyboard warrior meant by Hungarian. He was not a native English speaker. In English, we use Magyar for the nomadic steppe warriors who arrived in Europe in the 9th century, and Hungarian for the subject of the Kingdom of Hungary or a citizen of the Republic of Hungary. Hungarian uses Magyar for both. But there's another possible use of Hungarian, a person who lives in Hungary, or the land which would become Hungary. This is problematic, as it would include Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, Celts, and a range of other Germanic tribes, Dacians, Romans, Slavs, Ottoman Turks, and the Russian occupiers. So who were around in the Carpathian Basin 30,000 years ago? The first successful migration into Europe from Africa was 45,000 years ago. There was an earlier one, but they never survived. But the numbers were still very small, and most settled in the south rather than the Carpathian Basin. It was just a bit too cold. There was an ice age, and summer temperatures were lucky to reach 7 degrees on the steppe. But even so, these early settlers mostly died out by about 20,000 years ago. Less than 10% of their DNA survives today in modern Europeans. Any Europeans. Further, there's no evidence that they migrated east. The Eastern Asian DNA was far more stable than the early European. Those original people in Europe mostly just died. In fact, over the next 15,000 years, 3 major waves of settlers moved in. 14,000 years ago from the southeast of Europe. About 8,000 years ago, Neolithic farmers from the Anatolia area. And in the Bronze Age, about 5,000 years ago, they came from Russia, Ukraine. None of these were the ancestors of the Magyars, who came from the Ural Mountains and originally had their own distinctive DNA. Myth number 2. Hungarians are descended from Attila. Or, the Conquest was just a reclaiming of the empire of the Huns. Apart from shortening the timeline and misunderstanding the size of the Hunnish Empire, and overblowing Attila's role in its creation, are the Hungarians Huns? As one etymologically challenged person wrote, "Of course, Hungarians are Huns. That's why it's called Hungary." Actually, non-Hungarians call the country Hungary, from the Latin Hungaria, again from the word Ungri, which refers to several groups of steppe nomads. Hungarians call the country Magyarország. The Huns, on the other hand, were called by the Romans either Huni or Chuni. So even the Romans knew there were two different groups of people. The Huns were in Europe from just before 376 Common Era. This is when the Romans first noticed them and wrote about them. And then by 469 Common Era, they were gone, defeated, absorbed. Worth noting, in this 93 years, Attila was the king for less than 20. At the time of his rule, the Magyars were still just at the west of the Urals. The Magyars arrived in the Carpathian Basin mid-9th century. Over 400 years after the Huns left. Even short generations, that's 20 generations. While the Huns came from the far east, the Magyars can be traced much further west, about 3,000 kilometres west, just east of the Ural Mountains. What distinguishes the two? Apart from contemporary records, linguistics, DNA and archaeology gives a picture of their culture. One of the Huns' cultural practice was the reshaping of skulls of infants to make a long head. This was something that was never seen in Magyars. Two different people from two different areas of Asia and separated by centuries. Myth number 3. Hunor and Magor. Two brothers who were the ancestors of the Huns and the Magyars. One myth that can be traced back to the 13th century, that is over 300 years after the Magyars were first seen in Europe, said that Hunor and Magor were two brothers who were the ancestors of the Huns and the Magyars. It was first written by Simeon of Geza, who was a personal secretary of King László IV. King László could do with a myth that suggested that the Magyars were simply reclaiming their ancient homeland. What did the myth say? Hunor and Magor were either the sons of the giant Nimrod, or another descendant of Noah, and a hind, an interesting mix of Christian and pagan beliefs. Either of these sounds quite factually based. Not. Either way, they went out hunting one day and spied a horned doe, i.e. a reindeer, that led them on and on for days or weeks until they came to what we assume is the Carpathian Basin. They saw it was good land and went back, brought their cattle with them, and after a few years they discovered a camp of women and children who they abducted, and they married the two Alan princesses who were there. Incidentally, the Alans were driven out by the Huns 370 Common Era. It was politically very useful again in the 16th century. From this myth, Hungarians, as descendants of Hunor and Magor, were of Scythian origin, and the Scythians had once defeated even Darius and Alexander the Great. Their true vocation was war, which was the only activity that was noble enough to suit them, while the peasants were the descendants of those who had been condemned to cowardice in battle. Therefore, they deserved to be serfs, that is, agricultural slaves. Interestingly, the retelling again in the 19th century changed the sex of the deer from a hind, the early Magyar totemic animal, to a stag, a much more masculine and fitting, and aligning with Christian mythology. But as Huns and Magyars actually came from different parts of Asia, had very different languages and DNA, this must be seen for what it was, a cool way of claiming ancestral rights to the land and domination over the serfs. Sadly, entirely fantasy. Myth number 4. Modern Hungarians are descendants of a pure Magyar race. So not Huns, but there was a group of pure Magyars who came to the Carpathian Basin, and all the true Hungarians are descended from them. So if not descended from Attila, or Huns in general, the next step is to claim an unbroken descent from Arpad, or at least the Magyar conquerors. This one comes and goes according to a range of factors. The historical record shows the Hungarian warriors being wiped out in a series of battles. Initially, the Magyars' speed and ability with the bow made them feared and victorious. But by the Battle of Netchev, they were no match for professional soldiers in heavy armour. The Mongols in the 13th century caused the death of about 25% of the Hungarians, 500,000 people. Some were killed outright, but many also died of famine. Up to 80% of the settlements in the plains were destroyed. Afterwards, as many as 40,000 Cuman refugees were resettled in the plains to the southwest. Kunchag. In the 14th to 18th centuries, the main problem was the Turks. The losses were such that again, in 1481, 50,000 Serbs were settled in Hungary to make up for the loss of the local Hungarians. There were plenty of other battles, wars and famines. The Magyar warriors were the ones who tended to be killed. Usually the farmers and servants, who weren't always of Magyar descent, survived. So by the 20th century, the original Magyar blood was getting pretty thin. How thin? DNA samples were taken from early Conquest period graves. The sample size was small, just over 100, and they were further divided into conquerors and commoners, according to grave goods and all that sort of thing. About 30% of the conquerors showed Eastern Eurasian genes in the Y chromosome. The commoners had a lower percentage, about a third of that, so were mostly not descended from the Magyars, but rather typical Europeans who had lived in the area prior to the Magyar arrival, Slavs and Germans. One interesting thing that the original Magyars did have was lactose intolerance. So 30%. 30% is still low. It means by the time the Magyars arrived in the Carpathian Basin, the almost 2,000-year journey had mixed their genes with the Iranians, Turks and Scythians. The DNA analysis also shows the Magyars who arrived were a mix of men and women, contrary to some other myths. Now roll forward 1,000 years and let's have a look at the modern Hungarians. The modern Hungarian man has about 3 to 4% of those specific Magyar genes. The East Eurasian variant. Compare that to Finns who have about 50 to 70. It would seem that your Hungarianness is not a blood thing. It's cultural. Myth number 5. The Turul bird. Another myth from Gesta Hungaricum was that Almos, the father of Arpad, leader of the Hungarians, was descended from the Turul bird. The Turul is a mythological bird, no specific species, only that it's a predator. Sometimes it's envisaged as an eagle or a falcon or a goshawk. Many steppe people have similar myths and also revere the Turul. The Hungarian version has the Turul impregnate Emese, a princess, in a dream. A weaker version has her having the dream while already pregnant, so not quite the virgin birth thing. Her son from the Turul was Almos, dreaming, father of Arpad. In some versions, Almos was the first leader of the Hungarians and was ritually murdered in Transylvania after a catastrophic defeat in battle. After his death, his son Arpad became leader. In other versions, he was merely the conduit for Arpad's rise to the sacred ruler of the Hungarians, or in some versions, the military leader. The Hungarian tribes had two leaders, one for battle and one for religion. From Arpad's blood, many Hungarian kings would arise. But did they really come from a bird? Myth number 6. There was no conquest. Magyars came by invitation. I have come across a surprising number of sources on the internet claiming the Hungarians came in peace and were invited into the Carpathian Basin. Possibly they are each referencing a single site, and interestingly, one such claim comes from a semi-official site. The word honfoglalás, used by Hungarians themselves to describe the arrival of the Magyar, is usually translated as conquest. But the word actually breaks down to home occupation or home reservation. The winners do write the history. So, were the Magyar invited, and if so, by whom? Contemporary sources write as early as 862 Common Era, Hungarians, then based in what is now southern Ukraine, Attila, were hired as mercenaries by the Moravians to fight against the Eastern Franks. But there are suggestions this was not the first such offer they were given and accepted. I've seen references to similar deals as early as 835 Common Era. But a key gig was when the Byzantine Emperor Leo VI hired the Hungarians in 894 to fight for him against the Bulgar Empire. What happened next was unanticipated. The Bulgars hired the Pechenegs, and together they attacked the Magyar home base in Attila. It was this that forced them over the Carpathian mountains to settle in the Carpathian Basin. So, no invitation to settle, only invitations to fight, which led them moving into the Carpathian Basin. Over the next 100 years or so, the Magyars would receive many such invitations to help various regimes. They were very good fighters. And occasionally they would also free adventure for loot on their own behalf. And what of the homeland itself? Was it empty awaiting their arrival? Not at all. There is evidence of many other groups already living there. Mentioned are Avars, Slavs, Bulgarians, Greeks, Germans, Moravians and Valachians. But there is no evidence of mass graves from that period. So the Magyars did not carry out mass extermination at home. They may not have been invited by the locals, but they let them live there, subject to taxes, etc. After all, everyone needs farmers and food. So no violence at home, but no invitation either. Myth number 7. The Feszty Cyclorama is historically accurate. This is a huge cyclorama that was completed in 1894 for the 1000th anniversary of the Hortobágy. It is 15 metres high and 120 metres long, wrapped in a circle, and presently on display at the Opolstar National Heritage Park in a purpose-built building. It's an incredible achievement and well worth a look. But many believe it's historically accurate. Because it's featuring here, it gives you a clue that it isn't. You need to keep in mind the context of its creation. It was painted specifically to build the myth of the powerful, noble, European Hungarians, to make Hungarians proud of their heritage. But you can have pride while acknowledging the painting, well, it was tweaked. There are 7 major scenes. I'm not going to go through all of them here. No time. The most famous image is that of Arpad with the other tribal leaders, astride their horses, looking out over the Carpathian Basin. Arpad himself, at first glance, brings to mind a European knight in a romantic painting. Noble European, and with a hint of armour. The Magyars, of course, were not European and never wore armour. Instead, they padded their horses, which brings me to Arpad's horse. Paganed up a bit with feathers in its bridle, but the tack is all wrong for the period, and so is the horse. We have records of the horses brought by the Magyars as they buried them with the leaders. They are quite different from European horses. Stockier for a start. Speaking of animals, this brings me to the oxen wagon scene. I think these are meant to be Hungarian grey cattle, but the archaeological record does not support the common myth that their arrival was with the Magyars. Rather, they arrived much later, and for that configuration of 4 abreast, not good at the best at times, but for crossing a mountain pass. And in the foreground there were the bodies of the enemies, as in several of the scenes. But resistance within the Carpathian Basin was minimal. The Magyars did not have to fight with people for access, just nature herself. So no defeated Slavic leaders either. But for true fantasy, there is the shaman scene. Yes, Magyars were shamanistic. And some steppe tribes did have female shaman, although the main religious leader of the Magyars was definitely a man. But let's allow a woman to lead a sacred sacrifice. That's the horse, in case you missed it. But what is with the 19th century ballet dancers? All up, a romantic view showing the Hungarians as noble Europeans who arrived on heroic horses and killed the locals and raped the women. Both okay in the thinking of the 19th century, as these were lesser people, losers, and they didn't count. It's well worth viewing in person if possible. Just keep in mind, it's not historically accurate. There we are. 7 stories Hungarians tell about themselves, which turn out to have no basis in reality. There's nothing wrong with stories, even romanticising your ancestors. As long as tucked away in the back of your mind, you're aware it's just a story.